For 3 years, Sera Calloway was the perfect Luna. She attended every council meeting, memorized every pack member's name, learned every border dispute and harvest record and alliance treaty her mate had ever signed. She was the first one up and the last one to sleep. She covered his absences with excuses so seamless that half the pack did not know he had absences. She loved him the way some people work. Completely, without looking up, without asking whether the work was being noticed. It was not being noticed. She discovered this on a Tuesday night in November. Standing in a corridor she was not supposed to be in, outside a study door that listens and says, three people she trusted most in the world, discuss her, as though she were a piece of furniture. As though three people were a piece of furniture they had grown tired of arranging around. Her mate's voice, his Beta's laugh, and the woman he had apparently been choosing instead of her for the better part of a year. She's useful, her mate said, but manageable. She'll stay as long as we need her to.
The corridor was very cold.
Sera stood in it for exactly 60 seconds. She counted. It was the kind of thing you did when the alternative was making a sound. Then she turned around. She went back to their bedroom. She packed one bag. She took nothing that had been given to her. She was gone before the study door opened. Now, 18 months later, she was walking back in, and not one of them recognized her. She had been counting things for as long as she could remember, steps between rooms, seconds in silences. The number of times Dorian said her name in a week. She had stopped counting that one in the second year because the number had become too small to track without feeling the smallness of it. She counted border disputes, resolved, and harvest shortfalls managed, and alliance meetings attended, and pack members' children whose names she knew by heart and whose birthdays she remembered when their own fathers forgot. She counted because counting was a form of control, and control was the only form of safety she had ever reliably found. She had not found it in Dorian. She had tried. For 3 years she had constructed with enormous care and considerable intelligence the architecture of a life that seconds felt safe. A set of roles and responsibilities that gave her days shape and purpose, and the specific satisfaction of work done well. She was good at being Luna. She had quietly suspected for some time, considerably better at it than Dorian was at being Alpha. She had never said this to anyone. It was the kind of observation that cost more than it was worth to voice. The corridor was outside Dorian's study. She had been there because the pack's harvest records needed his signature, and for 6 hours and she was allegedly in meetings and finally at 10:30 on a Tuesday night in November, decided to slide them under the study door rather than wait until morning. She was tired. She was always tired. She had reached the particular stage of tired as its finding Sergal Baru's promise said tired. Sigax insisted on the other side of exhaustions, the stage where the body continues its functions with the mechanical reliability of something that has forgotten it, has a choice. She had heard voices when she turned into the corridor. She had slowed. Not because she was eavesdropping. She was not the kind of woman who eavesdropped. She was the kind of woman who knocked and waited and announced herself clearly. But because the quality of the voices was wrong, not the volume, the texture, the specific relaxed warmth of people who believed themselves entirely unobserved. Dorian's voice. Low and easy, the way he was when he was comfortable. Ren's laugh. His beta's laugh, which she had always found slightly too large for the spaces it occupied. And then a third voice. And then a woman's voice. One she recognized with the specific delayed recognition of a sound you have heard before without ever having reason to place it. Cass Sauce. Marn, the daughter of the Southern Reach Pack's head elder, a woman who had attended 3 diplomatic functions at Calloway territory in the past year and saw Sera personally assured who Sera had personally eaten was made welcome. Times. Because Sera was good at making people welcome. It was one of the things she did without thinking about it. The way some people breathed. She stood in the corridor with the harvest records under her arm and listened to the 3 of them talk. She was not counting yet. The counting came later. What came first was the specific, clarifying cold of understanding something she had been not understanding for a very long time. The way you step off the bottom stair in the dark and find the floor is not where you expected it, and your whole body recalibrates and your whole law operates in the instant before you catch yourself. She heard Ren say something about the council preparations. She heard Cassia say something about timing. She heard Dorian say with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never once considered the acoustics of a corridor. She's useful, but manageable. She'll stay as long as we need her to. The cold moved from her chest to her hands. She looked at the harvest records under her arm. She had spent 4 hours on them. She had found 3 errors in the previous year's tallies and corrected and annotated the corrections in the margins in her precise small handwriting so that whoever reviewed them next year would understand what had changed and why. She counted to 60. She did it the way she did everything, quietly, internally, with complete composure. 1, 2, 3. The study door did not open. The voices continued, muffled now. The specific muffled warmth of people settling deeper into their ease. 4, 5, 6. The harvest records were heavy under her arm. 7, 8. She thought about putting them down. She thought about knocking on the door. She thought about the 4 hours she had spent on the corrections in the margins. 9, 10. She counted to 60. Then she turned around. She walked back to the bedroom she shared with Dorian. Had shared. She understood now, in the past tense, that arrives before you have finished living the present. And she stood in the middle of it, and looked at the objects that filled it. 3 years of accumulated shared life. Photographs, books, the small carved box he had given her in the first year that she had kept on the bedside table because she's the kind of woman who kept things that had been given to her with love. Even when she was no longer certain, the love had been what she thought it was. She packed 1 bag. She was methodical about it. She was methodical about most things. indeed Sassen's task and Sneemans. She took her own end clothes, Sassen's she took Salmon's had brought into the relationship, the one she had bought herself with her own money, nothing that had been a gift, nothing that had been purchased on Calloway accounts. She took her professional documents, her personal correspondence, the small notebooks she had been keeping since she was 19, since which she recorded, in her small, precise handwriting, things she wanted to remember. She took nothing else. The carved box stayed on the bedside table. She picked up the bag. She picked up the harvest records. She walked to the study door and slid the harvest records underneath it. Sand. She had said she would deliver them, and she was a woman who did what she said she would do. And then she walked to the compound's eastern gate, and she left. The moon was a thin crescent above the Calloway tree line. It provided almost no light. She did not need light. She had memorized the pack's boundary maps years ago, because was memorizing thing that seemed useful, and she had always invested in things that seemed useful. She walked east for 4 hours before she allowed herself to stop and sit on a fallen tree at the edge of the neutral territories and put the bag down beside her and breathe across. She did not cry. She had expected to. She had expected the crying to arrive the moment she was no longer in a space where it could be heard, the way it always arrived in private after things that required composure in public. It did not arrive. She sat on the fallen tree in the dark and breathed, and in the place where the crying should have been, something else entirely. Something that felt distantly and improbably like relief. She sat with that for a while. Then she picked up the bag and kept walking. The way station at Greymere Crossing was the kind of place that existed space to be passed through, rather than occupied. A long, low building at the junction of 3 neutral territory roads. It provided beds and meals and no questions to the specific category of wolf who had reason to be in the neutral territory, that without affiliation. Traders, wandering scholars, unmated wolves between packs, and, in increasing numbers as the Grand Alpha Council approached, diplomatic plus staff from every sovereign territory on the continent, moving peace into position for the proceedings, perceives that would reshape the territorial map for the next decade. Sera had been at Greymere for 6 weeks. She had arrived with 1 bag, 400 in personal savings, and a skill set that turned out to be considerably more valuable in the neutral territories than it had been inside Calloway's compound. She could draft alliance correspondence in 3 dialects. She could read a boundary survey and identify its errors. She could manage a meeting between as whom parties disliked each other with the parties frequently forgot to dislike his client.
Much disliked senses, much distal, as in stemmistes, sent as a crate of breepores.
After they had agreed to things, they had come ruinous in intending to refuse. She had been doing these things for 3 years, for free. She began, at Greymere, to charge for them. She had clients within the first week. She had a waiting list by the 3rd. She was reviewing a border correspondence file for a mid-territory pack delegation on a Wednesday afternoon, when the man appeared at the door of the way station's small working room. She knew who he was before he introduced himself. She was not certain how she knew. She had never met him, had no photograph to work from, had only the descriptions that circulated in diplomatic circles about the Alpha King of the Ironveil nation, which were consistent on 2 points. He was younger than the title suggested, and he was more controlled than control usually looked. Both turned out to be accurate. He was perhaps 35. He wore traveling clothes with no insignia, which was either modesty or strategy, and she had been in diplomacy long enough to know that when you could not tell the difference, it was always strategy. He moved with the specific past economy of someone who had never needed to perform authority, because authority had always simply been in the condition of his existence. Still, he sat down across from her without waiting to be invited. She noted this and said nothing about it. "Sera Calloway," he said. "Sera," she said. The Calloway is no longer applicable. Something moved through his expression. Not quite surprise, more the adjustment of a man recalibrating a detail. "Sera," he said. The single name, in his even voice, had a quality she did not immediately examine. "My name is Caspian Vale." "I know who you are. Then you understand that I don't make offers without having considered them carefully." She put down the border correspondence file. She looked at him steadily. "Make the offer." He made it with the same directness she had used. No preamble, no decoration, no attempt to package the proposal in language designed to make it seem like something other than what it was. The Ironveil nation required a lead diplomatic emissary for the Grand Alpha Council, proceedings in 16 months. The position required someone with comprehensive knowledge of the Eastern Thubitnid spare territorial dispute architecture, fluency in multi-party alliance negotiation, and the specific ability to represent Ironveil's interests against a Calloway expansion. Claim that, if approved, would destabilize 3 of Ironveil's eastern border alliances. The salary was significant. The credentials were full and legitimate. The protection was absolute. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I have conditions. I assumed you would. I choose my own assignments within the scope of the role. I control my own public presentation, how I am introduced, asked, how my history is framed, what is disclosed about my previous position, and what is not." She paused. "And I am never, under any circumstances, to be deployed as a weapon against Calloway Pack, personally. Against their territorial claim, yes. Against Dorian Calloway as a political actor, yes. Not as a personal instrument of whatever history you have correctly inferred exists between us. He considered her across the table for 4 seconds. "Those conditions are acceptable," he said. "No friction, no counteroffer, no attempt to renegotiate the terms towards something more convenient." She had expected at least one of those things, and had prepared for all 3. The absence of them was more unsettling than their presence would have been. "Why me?" she said. "Specifically, because you built the Calloway Council preparation from the ground up, and you are the only person alive who understands its full architecture," he said. "And because anyone who can run Pack's diplomatic operations for 3 years without credit and walk away from it without making a sound, is someone I want on my side of a council table. She was quiet for a moment. You looked at the corridor, she said. I looked at the outcome, he said. The corridor is the outcome,
he said. The corridor is your business.
It was the correct answer. She was not certain she had expected a correct answer. She looked at him across the table and filed the fact of the correct answer carefully. In a part of her mind she was not yet ready to examine. When do we start? She said. Now, he said. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes. One in Plaisance Gorscouging. She noticed this only later, when she was reconstructing the conversations in her place internal way. The way she reconstructed all important conversations to check for things she might have missed. She had not missed anything. What she found, reviewing it, was that 11 minutes had felt considerably longer. She did not know what to do with that either. She picked up the border correspondence file, set it aside, and began. Ironveil's capital was called Ashenmoor, and it was nothing like Calloway territory. Calloway had been built for display. Wide, ceremonial avenues. A pack house designed to impress visiting dignitaries. Visiting dignitaries, the specific aesthetic of a pack that had been performing prosperity for so long, the performance had become the architecture. Ashenmoor was built for function. The buildings were old and dense, and arranged according to a logic that rewarded familiarity. Once you understood the city's internal geography, it was extraordinarily efficient. Before you understood it, it was simply opaque. Sera understood it within 3 weeks. She had always been good at reading the logic of places. It was related to the same faculty that made her good at boundary maps and alliance structures. The ability to look at a system and find its underliance, models that organize maps and surface into something architecture, the rules that organize the surface chaos into something navigable. She applied this faculty to Ashenmoor the way she applied it to everything, methodically and without announcing that she was month. The first Psastain is Caspides. At the end of the first month, she knew the city better than several of Cayan's Nispian's own staff who had lived there for years. She noticed that he noticed this. She noticed that he said nothing about it. She filed both facts. The work itself was everything she had been doing for 3 years, except that now she was doing it for herself. Or rather, doing it for Ironveil, which was not the same as doing it for Dorian, which meant was doing it with the full engagement of a person whose intelligence was being used. Contains rather than contained. The distinction was significant. She had not understood until she was excited. And much of her capacity at Calloway, how much her politiker had been devoted to managing the gap between what she could see and what she was permitted to say. At Ironveil, there was no gap. Caspian read everything she produced and responded with the specific quality of attention she had come to understand was his default, complete, focused. Frequently 1 step ahead of where she had expected him to be. He challenged her on 3 occasions in the first month. On all 3 occasions, he was right to challenge her. She revised her position each time without friction, which appeared to surprise him, something which in turn what's up called the quality, something about the quality of the before of the people he had been working with before. They developed a rhythm, not a personal one. a professional one, which was entirely appropriate, and which she was extremely careful to maintain as exactly that. They were two people working toward a shared objective with complementary skill sets and a mutual respect for competence. That was what it was. She was very clear about what it was. She was considerably less clear about why Sikandi didn't mad. When he did not appear at the morning briefing day in the 3rd month, the day felt structurally wrong in a way she could not account for professionally. She did not examine this. 16 months passed in the way that purposeful time passes. Quickly, with the specific texture of days that are fully used. And then the Grand Alpha Council convenes on neutral territory summit complex at Greyvale, and Sera Calloway, Sera Voss, as her Ironveil credentials read, Voss being her mother's name, a name she had always intended to return to, walked into the council chamber in Ironveil diplomatic colors for the first time. The chamber held 47 delegates. She had studied all of them. She knew their voting histories, their territorial interests, their interpersonal dynamics, their pressure points, their pride points, the specific combination of argument that would move each of them in the to move. Sands. Iron sands them. Sething stands. Sands. She took her seat at the Ironveil delegation table and opened her briefing folio and did not look up. She felt the exact moment Dorian Calloway entered the chamber, not because she saw him. Because the room changed, the specific atmospheric shift of a space adjusting to the arrival of someone whose presence requires adjustment. She had spent 3 years being attuned to that shift. The attunement, apparently, did not expire. She did not look up. She heard the Calloway delegation settle at their table. 6 people. She knew their names. She had briefed against each of them, and she continued reading her folio, and continued not looking up until its chamber's formal proceedings began. The chamber singing began, and looking up was simply what everyone did. She looked up. Dorian was across the room. He was looking at the chamber's general space with the expression of a man surveying a territory, which was how he looked at most things. He had not yet looked at the Ironveil table. She watched him begin the survey. Left to right, methodical, the way he had always reviewed a room. And she watched his gaze reach the Ironveil Place delegation and travel across its members and arrive at her face. 4 seconds. She counted them. In the first second, nothing. Simple visual processing of a face among faces in a crowded chamber. In the second, a slight shift, something snagging. In the 3rd second, the specific frozen quality of the man whose processing has encountered stasis, something it cannot immediately resolve. In the 4th second, recognition. Complete and total, and from the expression that followed it, considerably more destabilizing than he had expected anything in this chamber to be. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at her folio. She was not performing composure. She was composed. There was a difference, and it had taken her 18 months to build it, and she was not going to waste it on Dorian Calloway's 4th second. Beside her at the Ironveil table, she heard Caspian, who had seen the exchange. She was certain of it. He saw everything, say nothing at all. She found, to her own mild surprise, that his high science was exactly the right response. The formal challenge arrived on the third day of council proceedings. It was filed anonymously through the council's administrative office, through the council's administrative ziturance, a procedural complaint questioning the legitimacy of Tara's Ironveil appointment, suggesting that her credentials had been obtained under circumstances that warranted investigation, implying that a former Calloway Luna presenting as an Ironveil emissary represented a conflict of interest that compromised the integrity of the proceedings. It was, she noted with the professional detachment of someone who had drafted enough procedural documents to recognize the craft in them. Very well written. Precise language, the right citations, the specific calibration of allegation that stayed just inside the boundary of what required formal response without crossing into what could be immediately disproven. Wren, she thought.
It had Wren's particular signature.
The beta's preference for weapons that looked like paperwork. She handled the public response in the council chamber that afternoon with complete composure. She presented her Ironveil appointment documentation, her credentials chain, the formal record of her employment with the nation and across 16 months. She answered the presiding elder's questions directly and without elaboration, and she thanked the chamber for its attention to procedural integrity and returned to her seat. The challenge was tabled pending review. It would not survive the review. She knew that. The documentation was unimpeachable because she had built it to be unimpeachable, because she was the kind of person who built things to withstand the worst case, because the worst case had a habit of arriving. She sat at the Ironveil table for the remainder of the afternoon session and did not show anything on her face that she did not intend to show. That night, alone in her council chambers, she showed it, not dramatically, not the way it would have looked if someone had been watching. There was no one watching. She had made certain of that. It was quieter than that. She sat on the edge of the bed in her chamber and put both hands flat on her knees and breathed and let the day arrive in full. The challenge. Wren's precise language. Dorian's fourth second in the chamber. The specific texture of being looked at by someone who had decided you were manageable and was now encountering evidence to the contrary. She breathed through all of it. She did not hear the door. She heard her name, not loud. He had a voice that did not need volume. It carried by quality rather than quantity. The specific gravity of it finding her across the room without effort. She looked up. Caspian was in the doorway. The door, she realized, had not been fully closed. She had not closed it fully because she had not expected to need it closed. She had not expected anyone to be in this corridor at this hour. He did not ask if he could enter. He entered.
Not with the assumption of welcome, but with the specific decision of a man who has weighed the options and chosen the one that requires him to be present rather than absent. He sat down across from her in Zoom's Sing's chair in the low lamplight and looked at her. He did not say it was all right. He did not say she had handled it well, though she had. He did not offer any of the things people offered when they wanted to fix something they could not fix
that could not fix and needed to appear useful in the face of that limitation. He said, "Tell me about the corridor." She looked at him. "You know about the corridor. I know what happened after it. I don't know what it was like to be in it." She was quiet for a moment. The lamplight was low and warm, and the council complex was very silent at this hour. And she recognized, more tired than she had been. In 16 months, the specific tired of a day that had required her to be completely herself in public, while something else entirely was happening underneath. She told him about the corridor. Not all of it. She was not yet the person who disclosed everything, and she did not know if she would ever be that person. And she had made her peace with that about herself. But she told him about the harvest records, the 4 hours of corrections, the 60 seconds of counting, the carved box that she had left on the bedside table, not because she forgot it, but because leaving. See, it's because it was the one thing she could do that said everything she had decided not to say out loud. He listened the way he listened to everything, with the complete, consuming attention of a man for whom partial presence was not an available option. He did not move while she spoke. He did not nod or make the sounds people made to indicate they were following. He simply listened, which was more than most people were capable of and which she had not realized until this moment that she had been wanting. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You counted because you knew if you stopped counting, you would feel it." She looked at him. Nobody had ever said the right thing to her before. Not once, in 31 years of careful, managed living. She had said the right thing to a great many people. It was part of what she was good at, Sietz, the ability to find the exact sentence that a person needed and deliver it without making them feel managed by the delivery. She had not known until this moment that she had been waiting for someone to find hers. She did not know what to do with it. "Yes," she said, simply, because it was true and because he had earned a true answer. He nodded. Once. He did not press further. He did not ask what she had felt when she finally stopped counting. He seemed to understand Ignoask. She noted this, filed it, in the careful internal archive of things about him she was accumulating without examining. That the question would be too much and the silence was sufficient. And that knowing when to stop was as important as knowing when to start. He left an hour later. She sat in the lamplight for a long time after he was gone, looking at the closed door, feeling at the specific quality that had recently contained something significant and had not yet returned to ordinary air. By morning, she had filed it under things she was not examining. She returned to the council floor with her full composure intact and did not look at him differently than she had the day before. She was almost certain he could tell she was lying. She had taken the Eastern Corridor every morning for three weeks because the Eastern Corridors was the most direct route from her council chambers to the Wasting Semserents, to the delegation's conversation room, and she was a person who assigns best ones. Once she was assassin, she had identified the best ones and Simpsons these one, and did not deviate without reason. She had no reason to deviate on the morning of the 22nd day. She turned into the corridor at 7:30, her mortgage refuing, and the specific for then who accomplice a pasagoan of find the casting things if your nines stand up if there are day things to accomplish as before ace, and had already mentally sequenced them in order of priority. She heard his voice before she satsaged the door. The council's strategy room was midway down the corridor, its door habitually closed. It was not fully closed this morning. She slowed instinctively. Not eavesdropping. She was not the kind of woman who eavesdropped. She had established this about herself in the most expensive possible way. But because the quality of the voice was her name, she stopped, his voice, low and even, speaking to someone inside the room. His senior advisor, Maren. She recognized the second voice. A woman who had been with Ironveil's diplomatic corps for 20 years and who had specific careful warmth of someone who had survived a great deal of political weather and retained the capacity to be neither surprised nor alarmed by most of it. She heard, Sera, she heard, Sera has been exactly what we needed for this. She heard, useful. She heard, everything has gone exactly as required. The folio in her hands was very still. She was very still. The corridor was the specific cold of Earl's stone building. The kind of cold that clarified rather than numbed, that made everything around her very sharp and very present. Useful. She knew this word. She had heard it before in a different corridor, outside a different door that had been left open by a man who had not thought about the acoustics. She had stood in that corridor for 60 seconds, counting. And then she had packed one bag and walked out before dawn. Exactly what we needed. The folio felt heavy. She became aware that she was gripping it with more pressure than the object required. Everything has gone exactly as required. She had built 16 months of work on the premise that this was different, that the position was real, that the credentials were genuine, that the professional relationships constructed in Ashenmore was the precision to place and stand its concerns and the credentials it had things, and not what it felt like when she wanted to look at it through the particular lens of a woman from Liggs who had learned what it cost to believe what you wanted to believe. She had been so careful. She had been so specific about her conditions. She had negotiated the terms herself. She had watched him agree to every one of them without friction. And she had filed that as evidence of something. And she had been building on that evidence for 16 months. Useful. Exactly what we needed. She walked to the end of the corridor. She did not run. She was not as a woman who ran from things anymore. She had left that version of herself in the Calloway compound along with the carved box. She walked at her normal pace, which was measured and direct. And she turned the corner and went back to her chambers and stood in the middle of them and looked at the bag on the wardrobe shelf. She had not fully unpacked it. She had told herself this was practicality. The council proceedings were temporary by definition. There was no reason to unpack everything when she would be moving again in a matter of weeks. She saw now, with the clarity of a woman who was done not being honest with herself, that this was not why. She had not unpacked it because she had never, at any point in 16 months, fully believed she was going to stay. She understood, a woman who had learned to pack before the door closed. She took the bag down from the shelf. She began, with great composure, to think about what came next. She chose the night before the council vote deliberately, not because she was a person who timed things for dramatic effect. She was not. She was a person who timed things for strategic efficiency. And the night before the vote was the correct time, because the vote was the operational endpoint of 16 months of work. And she was always been precise, finding necessary about the difference between necessary and not. She had the speech prepared. She had written it in her head. Over the course of the day, in the spaces between council sessions, with the same precision she brought to every document she produced. It was a good speech, clear, direct, complete. It said what needed to be said without saying anything that didn't. She found Caspian in the council complex's upper working room at 9 in the evening. He was alone. She had expected him to be alone. He worked late, and he worked alone. And she had memorized his patterns over 16 months, the way she had memorized his everything, without intending to, simply because she was the kind of person who absorbed the information available to her. He looked up when she came in. She stood across the table from him, hand. She delivered the speech. She thanked him for the position. She told him the vote would succeed her. The groundwork was complete. The Allied votes were secret. The procedural votes were secured. The procedural challenges had been addressed. Its expansion was expansion would be defeated by a margin that left no room for appeal. She was no longer operationally necessary. She used the word with full awareness of what she was doing. She was precise about language, always, and she wanted him to hear it, the specific word, and understand that she had heard it first. She told him she would submit her formal resignation from the emissary position effective after the vote. She wished Ironveil every success. She thanked him for 16 months of genuinely good work. She picked up the bag. She had brought it. She did not examine why she had brought it, the specific instinct, that had made her retrieve it from her chambers before coming here. She simply had it, and it was packed, and she was holding it, and she walked toward the door with the specific measured of pace of a woman who had done this before and knew how it was done. Sera. Her name. Her single name in his even voice, with something underneath the evenness that she had not heard there before. Something that was working to stay level and not entirely succeeding. She did not stop. They had stopped this time. She heard her name in a corridor, and it had cost her 3 years. She was not stopping again. She heard him stand. She heard him cross the room. 5 steps. She counted them. She was always counting, and then he was between her and the door, not touching her, not physically barring her, simply present in the way that certain people were present. Completely. Occupying the space they stood in with a density that made the space itself feel different. "You heard me in the corridor," he said. She stopped. Her hand was on the door handle. The metal was cold. She was aware of the cold of it. In the specific way, she was aware of things when the rest of her attention was occupied with something larger. "You heard me in the corridor this morning," he said, "and you did not hear the whole sentence." She turned, not because she believed him, because she had made a decision, Sera Calloway territory, in the months since she left that she was going to be a person who stayed for the whole sentence, that she was not going to be managed by what she feared he would hear into leaving before she had heard it. That if she was wrong this time, she was going to be wrong with the whole sentence in her possession, not a fragment of it. She turned and looked at him and waited. His composure was doing something she had never seen it do before. It was holding. He was a man whose composure always held. She had watched it hold under conditions that would have dissolved most people's. But it was holding the way something holds when it is very close to not holding, the specific tension of a structure at its limit. "Tell me the whole sentence," she said. He told her about the form first. The council administrative record required a formal assessment of each delegation member's strategic contribution. A standardized document, specific language, the bureaucratic vocabulary of political utility. Marin had been asking him to complete Sera's assessment for 2 weeks, and he's been not completing it because he had found, when he sat down to produce it, that the language was not the language the form required, was not for sounds and for as council's contribution or alignment Sera's Sera's about Sera's contribution lied to Ironveil's councilant position to Ironveil's council position. He had completed it that morning. Marin had been in the room. He had used the form's language because the form required the form's language and because the assessment was an administrative document. And administrative documents were not the place for the other language. "What other language?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "The kind I was going to use after Marin left the room." She was very still. The door handle was still in her hand. She had not released it. She noted this and released it. "Tell me," she said. He moved to the Pivens disciplines, Asbitst, the same instinct she had observed in him before, spit, the instinct to address certain truths to the outside air rather than to a face. The habit of a man who had learned that honesty was easier sideways. He stood at the glass and looked at the Greyvale complex's night-lit courtyard below, and he spoke. 8 months before she walked into his council chamber. A neutral territory trade summit in the Greyvale Eastern Hall. The same complex they were standing in now. She recognized a detail that landed with a specific, precise weight. He had been there for a bilateral agreement with the Eastern Shore Confederation. She had been there. He did not know this until much later, until Miskent cross-referenced the summit attendance records as part of a Calloway diplomatic delegation observing the proceedings. He had not been watching her specifically. He had been doing what he always did in rooms full of diplomats. Reading the room, tracking the currents, noting who was positioned where and why. And then he had noticed a woman at the eastern side of the hall who was doing exactly what he was doing, not participating. Reading. He had watched her for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes she had, without appearing to do anything in particular, repositioned herself twice in ways that corresponded exactly to shifts in the room's conversational gravity, identified the two most important people in the room, and given neither of them her direct attention, and resolved. He watched this happen, could not have said exactly how she did it. A tension between some two opposing delegation members that had been building for the better part of an hour by the simple mechanism of saying something to one of them that made the other one laugh. Then she had disappeared into the general movement of the room, and he had not been able to find her again. 11 minutes, she said. 11 minutes, he confirmed. I spent 8 months thinking about 11 minutes. I did not know your name. I did not know your affiliation. I knew what you could do in a room. And I knew I had never seen anyone do it quite like that, and I could not find you in any record I searched. Because you were attending as Calloway's Luna, and your name in the summit record was listed as a dependent rather than a delegate. She thought about this. 3 years of attending functions as Dorian's Luna. 3 years of being the dependent in the record, the name that appeared after the primary entry. The person who was there in the role of accompaniment, rather than participation.
When did you find me?
She said.
When your disappearance created a gap in the Calloway Council preparation.
Large enough to appear in the regional diplomatic intelligence reports. He paused. I had been looking in summit records. I should have been looking in pack rosters. Something moved through his expression, the specific rueful quality of a man acknowledging a miscalculation. When your name appeared in the intelligence report, I cross-referenced it against the summit's attendance and understood the summit's dips, and understood that the woman I had been looking for and the woman who had walked away from Calloway territories were the same person. And then you sent a representative to Greymere. And then I went to Greymere myself, he said, because I had already sent representatives to look for things and found that I was better served by going directly. She absorbed this. The timeline reassembling itself. The 11 minutes at the summit. The 8 months. The representative at Greymere, who had not been a representative at all. The 11-minute meeting that had felt considerably longer, and why it had felt that way, and what that meant. The position, she said, the emissary role, was it real? He turned from the window. He faced her falsely, and she saw, without the glass between him and the question, without the sideways approach, a full unmanaged expression who had decided to put down something heavy. Every credential is genuine, he said. Every assignment you completed, every document you produced, every vote you secured, that is your work, done by you, belonging to you entirely. The position was real. The need was real. He paused. It was also the door I knew you would walk through. Not a rescue, not charity. A door that was already there, that I had legitimate need to open, that I opened at the moment I knew you were on the other side of it. He looked at her. You negotiated the terms yourself. I agreed to them because they were reasonable, and because I would have agreed to any reasonable terms you set. Both of those things are true simultaneously. She looked at him. She thought about the corridor at Calloway. The 60 seconds, the way a fragment of a sentence, heard in a particular cold and a particular state of exhaustion, had been enough to make a decision by. She thought about what it meant to make decisions by fragments. What it cost, what it had cost her, and what it had ultimately given her, and whether those two things balanced. She thought about 16 months of work that was hers. Documents she had produced, arguments she had constructed, votes she had secured. A body of professional achievement that existed independently of any corridor, or any sentence, or any door. Work she had done because she was good at it, and because doing it mattered, and because she had, finally, for the first time in her professional life, been in a room where the full extent of what she could do was not only permitted, but required. She thought about the 11 minutes at the summit, about being watched by someone who was watching the way she watched. Architecture of a room for the currents and the gravity and the resolution of tension, and recognized what she was doing because he was doing it too. She thought about you counted because you knew if you stopped counting, you would feel it. The right sentence. Delivered without strategy, without management, without the specific gentle engineering of someone who wanted something from the delivery. Simply. The right sentence, said because it was true by a man who had been watching her build herself back together for 16 months, and had the patience and the precision to wait until she was ready to hear it. She looked at the bag in her hand. She looked at the door behind him. She looked at him. I have been packing before the door closes since I was 28 years old, she said. It is a very efficient strategy, and it has served me extremely well. And I am aware that it has also cost me things I did not fully account for in the original calculation. He said nothing. He was listening with his whole attention, the way he always listened. I heard 2 sentences this morning, she said. I have previously made significant life decisions based on 3 sentences heard through a door left 3 inches open, and I am on record. In my own internal record, the one I keep in a notebook in precise small handwriting, as having decided that I would not do that again. She paused. So I am going to need the rest of the sentences, all of them. Whatever comes after everything has gone exactly as required. I am going to need you to say it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, everything has gone exactly as required. And I have spent 16 months watching you do it, and found that I am considerably less interested in the requirements than I am in you. Simple, without decoration. The way he said everything that mattered, directly, with the complete composure of a man who had decided that honesty was more useful than management. When to live with the consequences of that decision. She looked at him. She put the bag down. Not slowly. Not with ceremony. She simply set it on the floor beside her. The way you put down something you have been carrying for longer than was obviously of a person who has finally identified the right place to set it. She walked toward him, not toward the door, toward him. The distinction was the entirety of what she was choosing, and she was choosing it with full knowledge of all available information, with all the sentences in her possession, with the notebook of her own records, seest the terming of her own internal record. Same was not the same woman who had stood in the cold counting to 60. She was the woman who had walked out before dawn with one bag and built herself back from the inside out over 18 months and arrived in this room with her full complement of intelligence and difference, the hard-won ability
to tell the difference between
a fragment and a whole. She stopped in front of him. 8 months and 16 months, she said. That is a significant amount of thinking about 11 minutes. It is, he said. I am saying that you are more efficient than that. What made the difference? He looked at her, the specific, focused quality of his attention that she had been accumulating evidence of for 16 months without allowing herself to name what the evidence indicated. You, he said, specifically. She reached up and closed her hand around the lapel of his jacket, not pulling him toward her, simply holding. The grip of a woman who had decided and was not in the habit of performing decisions she had made. He brought his hand up to cover hers, not moving it, simply there, present, the warmth of it settling into her fingers, like something returning to its correct position. Outside, the Greyveil complex was very quiet. The council would vote in the morning. The groundwork was complete. The votes were secured. And she was, for the first time in a very long time, not thinking about the vote at all. She was thinking about a minute at a summit 8 months before she arrived. About being watched by someone who knew what he was watching. About what it meant to be seen entirely and accurately by a person who had the patience to wait until you were ready to be seen. She thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. She had not known that until now. Epilogue, 7 months later. A quiet morning in Ashenmoor, in a room on the 3rd floor of the building that had been assigned to Sera Voss, assigned formally, and was a was diskumsidiwen dast, assigned not sie bing hasenes dibigen to stexit bin singem skrarks dimwen assigned agreement substans, mans at her name, Ironveil nations steel, when the light was still pale, and the city had not yet begun the particular noise it made when it woke up properly. She opened the bag. It had been on the high shelf of the wardrobe since the night she set it down in the council's strategy room. She had left it there deliberately. Not because she was planning to leave. Not because she was keeping her options open in the old way. The exhausting way. The way of a woman who had learned to pack before the door closed. She had left it there because it was not yet time to unpack it, and she had been a person in the months since Greyveils who was learning to know the difference between not yet and not ever. It was time now. She carried the bag to the bed and sat cross-legged on the duvet and opened it. 3 items from the Calloway bedroom. She unfolded them and smoothed them and placed them in the left-hand drawer of the chest that was hers, below the window that faced east. She did not need to examine them carefully. She knew what they were. They were the beginning of the inventory. The 3 things she had packed in centers. 3 had sack in the dark in November, 4 years ago now, with 60 seconds of counting behind her, and the rest of her life ahead of her in a form she could not yet see. the additions from Greymere. A notebook, not the small, precise one she had kept since she was 19. That one was on the desk and had been since the first week in Ashenmoor. But a second one she had started in the way station, the one in which she had recorded, in those 6 weeks, the specific project of deciding who she was when no one was watching and no one required anything from her. She put it in the drawer with the Calloway items. It belonged in the same place. It was the same story. The additions from 16 months in Ironveil. More notebooks. Correspondence she had kept. Small objects accumulated in the way objects accumulate when you are living somewhere rather than passing through. A smooth stone from the Ashenmoor River walk that she had picked up because it fit her palm exactly. A pressed leaf from the oak outside the diplomatic annex. The small silver pin
that Caspian's senior advisor Marin had given her. After the council vote,
with the quiet and slightly ferocious warmth of a woman who approved of outcomes. She put everything in the drawers. The bag, empty, was lighter than it had been in 4 years. She looked at it for a moment. The object she had packed in the dark and carried through Calloway's eastern gate and sat with on a fallen tree at the edge of the neutral territories at 4 a.m. and carried to Greymere and carried to Ashenmoor and carried to Greyveil and set down at a door she had finally decided not to walk through. She put it on the high shelf. She looked at the drawers. Full now, the objects of a life distributed into their correct positions. The evidence of 4 years of building visible in the accumulated inventory of what she had chosen to keep. The council vote had been decisive. Calloway's territorial expansion claim had been rejected by a margin of 31 votes to 16. Sasting Stond, a margin that left no group's astral avenue for appeal, and that had generated in the diplomatic record the specific language of a claim that had filed on its merit, that had failed merits rather than on political opposition. The documentation Sera had produced over 16 months had been entered into the council's permanent record as the authoritative Skånt territorial dispute. Novlandford in Tattensur in the Land. It would be cited for decades. Dorian Calloway had been formally censured by the council for conduct related to internal pack governance, the specifics which had emerged during the proceedings. With the particular inevitability of things that had been true for a long time finally finding a venue. He had returned to Calloway territory afterward and found it smaller, is Aestum and Dring. Stands and Slausen Sextit, in the way that territories contracted around alphas, whose authorities have been questioned and stands found insufficient. Wren had resigned his beta position 6 weeks after the vote. The formal reason was personal. The actual reason was the specific calculation of a man who understood that the ship was taking on water and had decided to locate the nearest exit. Sera had read the resignation announcement with the same composure she brought to everything and had filed it under things that were resolved and required no further attention. Cassia Marn had returned to Southern Reach territory before the vote concluded. Sera did not know what had happened there. She had found, at some point in the 7 months since Greyveil, that she did not particularly need to know. She heard the door. Not a knock. He did not knock in the morning, in the specific morning context of a space that was hers, but that he had been moving through for long enough, that the movement had become familiar. He appeared in the doorway in the pale early light, a cup of tea in each hand, and looked at the bed and the open drawers and the bag on the shelf. He did not ask what she was doing. She had been waiting, when she first began to know him, for the moment when he would ask what she was doing, in a way that was not really asking what she was doing, the moment of disguised as curiosity. It had not arrived. She had stopped waiting for it. At some point, she could not precisely identify, which was itself a form of information she had recorded in the small, precise notebook. He crossed the room and set one cup on the bedside table beside her and stood looking at the shelf where the empty bag sat. She looked at it, too. "That's it," she said, not explaining. He did not need it explained. "Yes," he said. She reached for the tea. It was the right temperature. He had learned her preferences with the same methodical attentions, spot to everything, which she had found in 7 months of close proximity nastis blanks to be one of the most quietly significant things about him. The consistency of it. The way it did not vary, based on whether he wanted something, or whether the day had been difficult, or whether she had been easy to be around. It simply was. Every day, the same quality of attention, regardless of conditions. She had not known, until she encountered it reliably, how much of her energy she had spent in the previous life accounting for inconsistency. The vote record came through from the council administrative office yesterday, he said. The Eastern Territorial Survey has been formally entered as the permanent boundary reference for the disputed zones. Your name is on the record as the primary surveyor of record. She looked at him. My name. Sera Voss, he paused. Your mother's name, as you specified in your credentials. A beat. It will be in the regional diplomatic record permanently. She thought about this. Her name in the permanent record. Not as a dependent, not as a Luna, not as the person who had done the work and had the work attributed to the title rather than the person. Her name, precisely and correctly her sirs. She looked at the empty bag on the shelf. She looked at the full drawers. She looked at the pale morning light coming through
the east window and the city of
Ashen Moor below. It beginning at this specific hour, the noise it made when it was waking them up. She thought about a corridor in November. 60 seconds. One bag packed in the dark. A fallen tree at the edge of the neutral territories at 4 a.m, and the specific quality of a relief she had not expected, that had felt like freedom before she had understood that freedom was only the beginning and not the destination. She had walked a long way since that tree. She looked at Caspian, standing in the morning light, with his own cup of tea, looking at the city below the window, at the expression he had when he was thinking about things he was not yet saying. She had learned to read that expression. She had learned a great many of his expressions. In 7 months, in the way you learned the geography of a place you were staying in. First, the main roots, then the smaller ones, then the ones that were not on any map and that you only found by being present long enough for them to reveal themselves. She was staying, not because she had nowhere to go. She had built, over the past 2 years, more options than she had ever had before, more capability, and more credential, and more professional standing than the woman in the Calloway corridor could have imagined for herself. She was staying because she had made a decision with all available information, with all the sentences in her possession, and she was a woman who honored her decisions. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. She said nothing. He said nothing. Some things did not require words when the room already contained them. Outside, Ashenmore was waking up. The light was getting stronger. Somewhere below, in the diplomatic annex, the morning's work was beginning without them for a few minutes more. The bag sat empty on the shelf. The drawers were full. She was not leaving. And that is where we leave her, Wolfpack, standing in a room of her own choosing, with drawers full of everything she kept, next to one person who watched for 8 months and waited 16 more and got every sentence right. If Sera's story found somewhere true, if you have ever packed a bag to pack before the door closed and then had to learn how to unpack it,
drop a say in the comments and tell me what chapter brought you back.
I read every single one. Like this video, if you believe in women who count to 60 and then build something extraordinary, subscribe to the Wolfpack. New stories every week, and I will see you in the next one. We are nowhere near finished.